Hello to you on this Good Friday, perhaps the most ironically named day in the Christian calendar, as it seems strange to call a day good, upon which or within which our Lord was crucified for our sins. Of course, obviously, what a good and gracious and loving action, the atoning work of Christ on our behalf, and yet it seems a strange name regardless. I hope that you were able to take part in the service last night and that you will be turning your heart and mind to the things that this day recalls, both during the day today and perhaps tonight as well, as we look forward to celebrating the resurrection and Christ's victory over the grave on Sunday. For now, we're going to pick up our story where we left off. As you may recall, the elder had just suggested that he unhook the team of horses and go for help and leave the minister in the buggy. And that was the idea. And we pick it up there. It says the minister had no suggestions to make, so the team was unhooked. Assuring the minister that he would be safe in the buggy, he told him to wrap the blanket around him well. With that, the old man started off, heading right into the storm. It only took a minute for the minister to lose sight of him, as the storm seemed to swallow up the old man and the team. He confessed afterward that some strange thoughts coursed through his brain as he sat there shivering in the cold silence. But we will follow our old elder, who had gone for help. After a few minutes, he came to a rise, and topping this, he stood still, wondering where he was. The earth seemed to drop away in front of the team, and still they seemed ready to go on. Standing thus, he heard a different sound on the wind of this blizzard, and yes, sure enough, a dog was barking somewhere below him in the storm. He headed for the sound, and the team went crashing over the rimrock, and man and team piled up below. The folks at the elder's house had become worried, and the two sons were getting their horses ready to go to search the road to town for the travelers. While they were in the barn saddling their horses, their dog began to bark. So they went outside and stood listening, and on hearing some noise at the rim, they rode over there with a lantern. Sure enough, here was their father, covered with snow, trying to straighten out the team. "But where's the buggy?" they both cried out. "Well, boys, it's back on the hill somewhere, with the minister sitting in it, waiting for help. Hurry up there and try to find him before he freezes to death. I realize now that I should never have left him alone, as I don't even know how far away that buggy is." Well, those boys led their dad to the house, and the mother took charge of him. They climbed to the rim and started riding in half circles from rim to rim, ever widening the arc, shouting and waving the lantern. Suddenly one of them saw a black shape ahead in the storm, and yes, there sat the minister, too cold to shout back at the boys. They wasted no time and hustled that minister to the house, which was only a quarter of a mile away. The team had headed straight for home after all, but they had taken a direct route, the way the crow flies. The minister was soon clad in some dry clothes, warmed and fed, and with dry slippers on his feet. He called them together and humbly thanked God that they had arrived safe and sound. Thus began that servant of the Lord's first trip. With a big day ahead on the morrow, they all went to bed, thankful and hopeful, for tomorrow the Lord's Supper was to be celebrated for the first time in 8 months for some, and almost a year for others. The old elder did not sleep so well that night, and in fact, the strenuous trip of the day had been too much for his weak heart, and from that time on, he was never well again. Morning came, the snow had stopped falling, and the weather was clear and cold. It was thought to be too cold in the bunkhouse, so services were to be held in the large kitchen of the home ranch house. Long before 9, the people began to arrive, so before the service, the boys told us the story of the lost preacher. But they spoke very highly of his grit and were quite proud of being the ones to find him the night before. They were called to bring in some boards to sit on. By laying a long board on 2 chairs, 5 or 6 people could sit down on it. As they had no small table, the sewing machine was rolled to the front to serve as the communion table. The service began, the minister's clothes looking slightly shop-worn after being dried by the stove. Yet he looked dignified to us anyway. This was no reading service. I will never forget that communion service. The kitchen filled with men, women, and children. Even the children seemed to realize that this was special, for they all kept quiet. The minister behind the sewing machine read the form, and when he had broken the bread, it was so quiet that a pin could have been heard falling to the floor. Surely here was the communion of the saints, in rather a strange setting, to be sure. But we were all aware of the fact that, where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there will I be in the midst of them. And so did the pioneer missionaries and ministers work with their people in the settling of the West. All hail to them, who traveled miles over windswept prairies to visit those families in tents, log houses, and barns. They became as one of us, sorrowing with the sorrowing, and rejoicing with us when blessing had been received. Nor were they overpaid for this work. Many times they went out of their way to save money for these struggling congregations, not accepting pay for their services. Many times they got lost on the prairie. Sometimes it was serious and sometimes humorous, and these men could also see the humorous side of these experiences. I could tell of many elders, also, who got lost in their family visiting. One time, another home missionary was spending a week or 2 with us. One day he decided to go for afternoon coffee to a neighbor of the people with whom he was staying. He could see the house plainly across the prairie from where he was, so he boldly started off. He safely arrived at his destination and was soon seated at the coffee table. Talking, he forgot what time it was, and as it had become dusk, he thought that he had better return now. It was only 1.5 miles across the section to his home place, but what a section it was, all canyons and coulees. But since the way was all downhill, he would surely reach his boarding house before supper. He started off, and his friend, whom he had visited, began to do his chores. Another neighbor lived within easy calling range from where the minister was leaving. He was also doing his evening chores. Darkness set in, and on making their final rounds, one man shouted to the other, "The coyotes are very active this evening. Listen to them howling down there in the canyons." The missionary had been gone for over 2 hours, and naturally they thought he had long since arrived at his destination. They listened for another minute or 2, and again they heard that howling. This time it didn't sound like coyotes, but more like a human voice. They got a lantern and started toward the sound. As they came closer, they shouted, stopped, and listened. Again they heard a call. As it was quite dark, they could not see far, but by shouting they drew closer. One of them, who had done most of the shouting, hollered out, "Who is it?" And listening, they heard this come out of the canyon. "It is the Domine. It is the Domine." Sure enough, there was our missionary, lost in a box canyon, working his way uphill instead of downhill. That poor man had wandered in this maze of canyons for 2 hours or more, and finally began calling as this is what the brethren thought were coyotes howling. Well, he laughed about it, and after they brought him home in a buggy, and the incident was soon forgotten. These servants of God have now gone to their reward, and as I am writing this, I think of the easy berths, comparatively speaking, that our candidates fall into now. Those pioneer missionaries were truly wandering Levites. I can also say that their work was highly esteemed on account of the way that they lived among their people. Chapter 6. The Settlement Grows. The first winter proved to be a hard, cold one. Much snow fell, and those who arrived that early winter had no picnic getting their stuff unloaded from the boxcars and hauled out to the settlement. All who were already located in the settlement would take teams and wagons to go to town to haul out a load for the newcomers. In this way, most of the later ones got their stuff all hauled in one day. This was a good way to get acquainted, and as most of these people were strangers to those already there, this community hauling broke the ice at once. All the newcomer was expected to do was to pay the livery bill and the meals. Money was scarce for those who were already located, so a little fresh money from the east was always welcome. This was true not only for the town merchants, but also for the settlers, since they always had something to swap or sell. The main thing those first years was to try to get $1 once in a while for things which were essential, and also for collection on Sunday. No matter how poor these people became, the collection on Sunday was never stopped, and there was always enough money to pay the railroad fares for our classical supplies. That first winter taught our people the primary lesson of hanging together or hanging separately. I had homesteaded that fall on a piece of open ground, and after going east to get married, I was back in the settlement after an absence of 2 months. According to law, I had to build inside of 5 months or lose my rights to the land. Being full of enthusiasm, we decided to haul some lumber from town and dump it on the ground so building operations could begin in the spring. We made 3 trips to town for lumber and spent 3 weeks doing it. The snow was so deep and it was so bitterly cold that 3 days were needed to make the return trip. I had homesteaded, but I really didn't know exactly where the land was. There were no fences anywhere, only certain landmarks to go by. I knew that the land had a creek running through it, so the lumber had better be dumped near the creek. The first load, which we hauled, proved to us that we still did not know the lay of the land. The first day out, we made 15 miles and stopped at a homesteader's shack. He also had a small barn. Nobody was home, but we put the horses in his barn. On going into the house, we noticed a large pot on the stove. We were cold and hungry and naturally looked into the pot. There we saw beans, large brown beans, stiff but well cooked. We fell to it at once, before even lighting the stove. Suddenly my partner looked at me and burst out laughing. He said that we were like hogs. By that time, reason had come back somewhat, and we made a fire in the customary sheep stove. We thought that we had better leave some beans in the pot, in that Mike, the homesteader, might be home today or tomorrow and would be figuring on his beans. We were soon warmed up, and it was now dark, and we sat drowsing in our chairs when suddenly we heard the clump of horse hoofs outside. Shortly thereafter, here comes Mike into the lamp-lit room. "Oh, yes, we made ourselves at home." "Oh, yes, we had something to eat." "Sure, thank you. Beans. Fine, old man." "Well, boys, why didn't you look in that box in the corner? There's bread, coffee, and bacon." So late as it was, Mike sets up another feed, and we fell to it again. We stayed with Mike that night and started off again the next morning. Now this man had never seen or heard of us before, and we had used his barn and precious hay. We had taken possession of his home, eaten most of his beans, burned some of his scanty supply of firewood, and he never seemed to think anything of it. He had herded sheep here for years, but as settlers came, he decided that he better grab a piece of land also. That was the spirit of the West. That was Western hospitality. The unwritten law of the West was that you must never lock your door. Always keep some wood, food, and matches in the house. On the other hand, any wayfarer was welcome to stop for a feed or overnight, providing he would leave some new wood at the stove and wash any dishes which he had used. This was rigidly adhered to by all in the 8 years which I spent on the homestead, except in very rare cases, and the men who stole or abused these rules were marked men and ostracized by society. Many a life was saved in this cold, bleak land by these simple rules, and of course that worked both ways. In later years, I often took Mike's grocery order out to him, and we were the best of friends. His own horse, falling over backwards, killed him, and the saddle horn went through Mike's chest. We all missed his Irish wit and humor. We had 5 miles to go from Mike's place to my homestead, but there was no road or trail. We started out in the general direction according to the map. It took us all day to make those 5 miles, and we unloaded and loaded that lumber 6 times, as the wagon would be stuck in 6 or 8 feet of snow. We could not see the canyons, for they were full of snow, and sometimes we would crash through and the horses would flounder in the snow. That meant unhook, try to get the horses out, and on the other bank of the coulee, and unload. Then take the chain, pull the wagon out, load it, and try again. This was all back-breaking, heart-rending work, but we were full of ambition, and all these things would be forgotten when the crops started to come in. That evening we arrived on my land, and I had set up a marker, and we finally unloaded that lumber for the last time. We could not get back to camp, which was 3 miles away, so we stayed at another homesteader's place overnight. The next day we broke a trail to the camp. 3 days had gone by. Everything was frozen up. The kettle cover was an inch above the kettle. The bread was frozen hard as a rock. All through this trip, the thermometer had hovered around 20 below zero, and we had sweat and struggled to get 1 load of lumber out to the site. This is only an example of common experiences. Everyone had experiences as bad or worse than this. There was no easy way to get started. The distances were too great, the hills too high, and the climate too cold to get anything done quickly. And we will pick up there tomorrow. Bye-bye.